So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm very pleased to introduce Eleanor Davey to you, a senior lecturer at the Humanitarian and Conflict Research Institute at the University of Manchester. Eleanor is an historian, and more precisely a historian of humanitarianism. Perhaps she will tell us what it means and whether she likes to be called a historian of humanitarianism or not. She devoted her PhD research to the intellectual roots of Médecins Sans Frontières, or rather to Sans-Frontiérisme as a movement, by looking at how the trajectories of Third-Worldism and Sans-Frontiérisme crossed each other, coalesced, influenced each other, and perhaps how one came to replace the other. The study particularly focuses on Médecins Sans Frontières. The research was published in 2015 in a book, that's here, entitled Idealism Beyond Borders, The French Revolutionary Left and the Rise of Humanitarianism, 1954-1988. The book is available at the Centre de Doc, actually, if you want to get a copy of it. Before joining the HCRI in 2014, Eleanor worked at the Humanitarian Policy Group of the Overseas Development Institute, where she led a project on the global history of humanitarianism, looking at practice and policy. Her current research explores the relationship between humanitarianism and national liberation struggles. There were several reasons for us to want to invite Eleanor at a conference. The first reason is that the book is absolutely fascinating. It took a while to bring the author over, but the conversation started a couple of years ago, actually. In the book, our very own Ronnie Broman figures prominently, and a few others, characters who are in the room tonight. As well as the Fondation Liberté Sans Frontières features prominently. La Fondation Liberté Sans Frontières has somewhat a distant ancestor of the crash. And it explored generally the roots of political engagement of MSF aid workers, or why they could at times be proeminent critics of the role aid could play in different situations. The second reason is that, of course, as you know, history as a discipline is very important to the work of the crash. As the participants to our coordinated training who are with us tonight will know and will have noticed. We are, as observers of humanitarian practice, often stunned by the presentism of humanitarian action observers, whether the observation come from practitioners or from the media. And we make it part of our mission to induce a sense of history amongst colleagues from MSF and the aid sector. And the book of Eleanor certainly helps us do that. History of humanitarianism, which will be, of course, a central topic of the discussion tonight, is a growing field. It attracts more and more young researchers, offering a view on history of organization, practices, culture, and debates. And to quote Eleanor in her own introduction, history in such debates is not an antiquarian interest, but a living thing. And we'll try to see how. We've had a series of history conferences hosted by the Crash, examining, for instance, the history of MSF in France with Caroline Isambert, last December, or when inviting Guillaume Lachenal a few years ago, looking back at a more distant past, the one of colonial medicine, and how partly reminiscent it is of today's practice. So today's conversation will take us somewhere in between those two places, as it looks at the history of humanitarianism and that of MSF in particular in interaction with global ideologies. So Eleanor will introduce her own intention when she began her research and when putting the book together. So I'll be very brief here, noting simply that from a reader's perspective, it is remarkably enlightening to understand MSF enterprise not only as the result of the Biafra war or the initiatives of a few, but as a product of its times at a period of fascinating intellectual and militant effervescence in France and beyond. So thank you very much, Eleanor, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. You're right, it has taken me a while to come, not due to lack of interest, but certainly it's an intimidating audience to be speaking to. But I am very much looking forward to the reactions and discussions, which I think will be quite different from the ones I'm used to having. Before I really start in proper, just to say, this is a little bit like I'm in teacher mode now, but I can see there are some people standing. There are seats up the front if you want to take a seat before we get going. No judgment if you want to reserve the option of sneaking out the back door, but please don't hesitate to come forward if you would like to take a seat. There are places available. I won't maybe labour the point about how I got to this particular study. We could talk about that perhaps in discussion about what it was like to work at the Overseas Development Institute after doing a PhD in this field. But just to say, when I started the study that the book is based on, I didn't particularly think that I would be contributing to humanitarian debates per se. I think I had a limited understanding of what that would mean, and I was thinking of myself as a historian of France. And in that sense, the importance of the politics for me was throughout the whole study, and I didn't come in with the idea that politics was somehow separate from the humanitarian side, and I think you'll see that in what I'll talk about this evening. So I've got 3 main sections to my talk today. The first section is a sort of an overview of the book, basically. I'm trying to give you a sense of what it covers, broadly speaking, in terms of chronology, in terms of some of the key themes, and a bit of a feel for what I tried to do, basically. So it moves around a little bit. Bear with me, I'm not sticking tightly to chronology here, and that's very intentional. But the first section will give you a sort of overview, if you like. The second part of my talk will be focused on Biafra. There are many other things to say about the topics I cover, but I thought I couldn't really come here and not talk about Biafra and that moment and some of the debates around the founding of MSF. And then following that, I'd like to talk about something that is a little less obvious as a choice, which is about the terrorist attack during the Munich Olympics of 1972, which I'm hoping will let us kind of get into some of the sort of more detailed discussions in relation to the third worldist part of the book. So that's what you can expect from me so far. So as Michaël said, the book covers a period from the 1950s to the 1980s, and it traces a series of debates about ideas about the third world. So it's not a book that claims to give you sort of rich accounts of those global events, but to look at how those events were refracted through or considered through French political engagement at that time. So specifically, it's about the versions of revolutionary left-wing engagement and humanitarian action in that period, 1950s to 1980s. And it's quite important to stress that this idea of versions or different registers of engagement, I don't claim, the publisher wanted me to put the phrase "the origins of humanitarianism" into the book's title, which I think would have been overselling a book that really starts in the 1950s, if you look at the deeper history of humanitarianism. But it's very much versions of those kinds of revolutionary and human rights and humanitarian engagements that relate to this period. So the term third world, I'll use it this evening. It's obviously a problematic term from the current point of view, but as a term it was coined in 1952 by a French demographer called Alfred Sauvy, who used it to capture this idea of a kind of rising body of nations comparable, in his claim, to the ignored, the exploited, a third estate that won its rights with the French Revolution. So in that mindset, we could see a historical march of events seen in victories over French colonialism in Indochina and North Africa in the 1950s, the Bandung Conference of African and Asian States in 1955, and Fidel Castro's revolution in Cuba in 1959, for example. I put 1954 in the book's title because it helps me to signpost some key events, but also some key features of the study. So 1954 in May, you have the defeat of France in the War of Independence in Indochina. The same year in November, it's often taken to be the start of the Algerian War, with the proclamation by the Front de Libération Nationale of their campaign and the launch of a series of concerted attacks on the 1st of November of that year. And Algeria is one of the very important events in the book, or sort of series of engagements, because of its role in the anti-colonial movement, because of the way it challenged some of the universalizing ideas about France and its place in the world. So it served as an important galvanizing moment in this idea of third world revolution. 1954 is also the year of the founding of the first bookshop owned by François Maspero. And this bookshop is a kind of meeting place, a place of discovery for ideas about the third world and for the people who wanted to explore those ideas. So that, for me, really captures the fact, again, that this book is about the engagement, the views of the third world, rather than those events in a kind of more direct way. So a constellation of different kinds of radical engagements were inspired by this perception of the rising third world. And this is very much about a global future, in the sense that those who engaged in this way felt that it was revolution in the third world that would change their own societies as well. This is also to do with the state of communist politics in the Western world at this time too. In its most extreme kind of invocations, incarnations, this revolutionary engagement has some pretty ugly advocacy of violence. So there are parts of the book, particularly the earlier chapters, where we see some language that doesn't date terribly well, but really an attempt to propose a moral form of violence that is more just, as part of a vision of the world where violence is everywhere. So this is an image of the world that contrasts the violence of colonialism, of racism, of structural inequality, and sees revolutionary violence as more just than those forms of violence. So that's some of the material that I cover in the earlier phase. If we're looking at the ideas and movements that are active in this time, there's quite a wide reach, often a cultural reach as well, but we're talking about quite small numbers of people engaged. Some of these groups were very short-lived, although they connected to much longer historical trajectories as well. When they started to be criticized, the process was very multifaceted and very complex. And it's important to remember that this is partly hard to unravel because in a retrospective sense, we tend to talk about third-worldism or tiers-mondisme as a singular. This comes later on. We're grouping these different things together. At the time, they were much more plural. There were many more differences to take account of. So if you had, for instance, if you had engaged at the time of Chairman Mao, you might have done that for different reasons from those students who engaged, say, 15, 20 years later under the sign of the Cultural Revolution. If you were committed to the politics of Che Guevara, that would be different, although connected to the politics of opposing the Vietnam War. So while there are similarities and connections, it's really in retrospect that they become lumped together. But we have to keep those differences in mind when we look at how they fell apart or they unraveled. So for individuals, sometimes the rethinking of revolutionary engagement was related to a direct experience. There were a lot of people who traveled to the countries that they were interested in, perhaps as journalists or foreign correspondents, some people living for longer periods. So that could have influenced the sort of rethinking of these politics. There were others who were more influenced by what they read, what they heard secondhand. So again, quite a range of different types of experiences here, and it is difficult to generalize. So that's kind of the middle of the book, that part. And along the way, what I've tried to show is a kind of long conversation about these different ideas. Some people come and go from that conversation, the ideas themselves evolve, but it's like a kind of public conversation about the notion of the suffering of others, the notion of responsibility, intellectual responsibility, personal responsibility, and working from a kind of leftist view of a certain way of thinking about injustice in the world towards human rights, humanitarian ideas, and what at the time was often referred to as ethics-based politics. But this is happening over decades. This will come up in some of my later discussion, but I thought one point to just emphasize a little here is how there were moments in that process where we see very hybrid kinds of things. So, for example, very much rights-based language coming up in some of the third-worldist, tiers-mondiste engagements, which almost seem to function like a kind of gateway to that ethics-based politics later on. So one example of this is the way that activists use trials of their activism to highlight the right to freedom of speech or to protest against the use of torture, so using some language of rights in the forums where they were being prosecuted for their engagement. Or in the case of the Russell Tribunal, which was a kind of citizens' tribunal that was held in 1966 or 1967. The Russell Tribunal found the US guilty of genocide in Vietnam, and it combined a very partisan stance about the war with the use of very legalistic ways of judging the US actions. So you see a reference to international law and precedent at the same time as you see a very partisan form of moral and political opposition to the United States. So coming to the date that I use as the end of the book, 1988, it's a little bit of a conceit, but I chose that date because there's an earthquake in Soviet Armenia in that year that foregrounds some of the shifting dynamics to do with the end of the Cold War. And it's also a time when French government starts to have official positions for humanitarian secretaries of state or ministries and so on. So it's on the cusp of that 1990s period in a way that made me feel that I should sort of draw the line there. The last major episode that I look at in the book is about the Ethiopian famine in the mid-1980s and the political campaigning that MSF France was doing at that time. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this now because I think it helps to articulate an argument that might feel a bit abstract from just a summary of the book. So I hope that will help in getting a sense of why I think these discussions matter. So you may be familiar with some of what I say next, but please bear with me. In the mid-1980s, or in the early 1980s, I should say, there is an awareness of famine, but not a high public emphasis on it in Western media. And it's not until 1984 that this mass audience is reached in the West, and we get the Band-Aid and Live Aid phenomena that you will be familiar with. In that coverage, there's a lot of emphasis on a kind of idea of drought causing famine, innocent victims, starving children, as we see also in an earlier period. But quite often that coverage left out the really crucial social engineering that the Ethiopian government was doing at the time and its war against secessionist groups, particularly in the north of the country, so Eritrea today, Tigray. So international aid in this period is part of that counterinsurgency campaign, part of the social engineering that's happening at the time. And MSF very famously is kicked out of the country, and this happens because of a combination of statements that come both from field staff and from staff in Paris. So not only one or the other, but a combination of those statements from different parts of the organization. And MSF goes on record in criticizing this manipulation of the aid effort by the Ethiopian government. So in this case, we're seeing an instance of speaking out, of témoignage, that is not simply about human rights abuses, if we can say simply human rights abuses, but about the place of aid within that system. It's about how aid is really part of the human rights abuses, not separate from it. And this was very controversial for other agencies there at the time. At the same time as this, the leadership of MSF France is also waging an ideological battle against what they see as lingering third-worldism, lingering leftism, and a kind of appeasement of communist tendencies in French aid circles. So this is behind the creation of Médecins Sans Frontières, the illustrious precursor of Crash, which is a think tank that is sort of aligned with MSF. Technically, it has separate governance, but it's very entangled. You can be easily forgiven for thinking it has the same governance at the time. And it's part of a number of different public stances that reflect this anti-communist engagement, particularly on the part of leading figures in the organization. So we see this in relation to Cambodia and Afghanistan, notably at the time. There's a conference in January 1985, so really in the midst of this Ethiopian mobilization, a conference held in Paris, which is very controversial, draws heavy criticism from other members of the aid world, from intellectuals, and from those associated with the ideas that are being criticized. And the reactions to that conference highlight two ways, I think, in which political activism and humanitarian action have been portrayed as opposed. And in this period, because we're looking back over the revolutionary engagement, one of them is more associated with the defense of that engagement, one is more associated with a repudiation of it. So in 1985, in reaction to that conference, Claude Julien, who is the editor of Le Monde Diplomatique, he says, we have to remember Africa and Asia are more than mud and refugee camps. And he's really frustrated with the way that leaders of MSF at this time, including Ronnie Brauman, who isn't here, unfortunately, this evening, but they're using their field credentials, their work in those camps, in order to present a vision of the third world, which is a drastic change from that revolutionary, progressive, essential driving force that we associate with the third worldist period. So part of his frustration or his anger is to do with the shift of visions of the third world from a kind of an essential part of global politics to an image of suffering and helplessness and starvation. So that's one reaction. In the same time, a former Maoist, so again another person associated with these sort of leftist circles, is reflecting on his engagements as part of this conference. And he says, we have to accept that we fought the wrong war, that our anti-Americanism was misplaced in the long term, essentially. And this view of revisiting or repudiating these left-wing engagements that people like Breuil put forward create a very strong impression of backlash. There's a sense of disillusionment and rejection that you see in this period. Now, of course, there is some truth to this, but what I try to show in the book is that we need to keep a kind of a complex sense of what the relationship has been between these different kinds of engagement, because there's a sense in which humanitarianism can be considered a legacy of some of those internationalist engagements. There's a sense in which it was for a long time being shaped by, in dialogue with, and reacting to those engagements in a way that is fruitful and not simply about rejection. And we've got to keep that mix of things in our minds, I think, when we talk about the politics of this period. So that's what I hope that I have done in the book. It's not a linear process. As I've emphasized, there are particular moments that are crucial, but if you take any one of these threads, you might sort of place that emphasis in different ways. And that's part of why in my talk this evening I'm moving around a little bit chronologically to give you some feeling of that. So I'd like now to turn to the case of Biafra. Now, in France, at Médecins Sans Frontières, there are two main problems in talking about Biafra. One is that although if you, say, looked on the website of MSF, you would see a kind of rough origin story about a founding act of témoignage and a break with the Red Cross, that moment doesn't exist in the way that you could sort of mark it on a calendar, give it a precise date. It's not quite so simple as that. Secondly, that if you make that claim in the French kind of humanitarian context, you play into a longer argument about memory and identity and the construction of a Sans-Frontiériste form of humanitarianism. So it's impossible to kind of enter this space without becoming part of those arguments about identity. So what I'll do in this section is just introduce some key dynamics in case you're not familiar with how this period is discussed, and then talk about those problems, which is in a way, it's one problem all tangled up. So as Michaël mentioned, I'm amongst a group of scholars, a field of scholarship that considers itself to be working on the history of humanitarianism. And there's somewhat of a tendency within that field to make Biafra sort of the beginning of everything modern in humanitarianism. So there's an important idea about the founding of organizations, not just MSF, but also Concern, an Irish organization that emerges from this time. There's a notion of Biafra as the first televised famine, the moment when that image of a starving Africa that we see in Ethiopia is fixed in people's minds. In some of the literature in France, you'll see claims about Biafra as the origins of ingérence, so droit d'ingérence, and leading into responsibility to protect. Not everywhere. But generally a consensus that this is a crucial moment. So Alex Duval, a famine analyst, called Biafra a formative experience in contemporary humanitarianism. Fiona Terry called it one of the most insidious examples of the manipulation of suffering and humanitarian action to gain international legitimacy. So what actually happened there, in a short version, is that you have a declaration of independence by Biafran secessionist groups, declared the Republic of Biafra in May 1967. From roughly a year later, Biafra is landlocked, which creates a situation of famine amongst a very nasty conflict, and turns into a major humanitarian mobilization from roughly summer 1968 onwards. The Biafran leadership famously hired a PR firm called Mark Press, which managed its external communications and also did a lot of liaising with journalists. The war ends with the Biafran surrender in January 1970, but the sort of public attention has faded before that. Because Biafra is landlocked, the relief effort through the airstrip at Uli becomes essential. So that airstrip is used both to fly in arms, military weapons and to fly in relief. And it's extremely busy in the period of this airlift. All of the relief flights were taxed, so that brought in a lot of currency. There was also an inflated exchange rate, so that all of the work that was done in a kind of humanitarian mode was fueling the resources of the Biafran leadership, their war effort. At the same time, there's a shift in the public portrayals of the war from a claim of sovereignty, the existence of a nation in Biafra, to the idea of a people under threat of genocide. And this is tied in with the famine. And this is a portrayal that is directed internally, the idea that Biafrans were at threat of extermination from the federal Nigerian authorities, and also externally and used by supporters, international supporters of the Biafran cause. So turning to Biafra and MSF, the interpretations of what happened there, the dynamics of the conflict as well as the act of speaking out, are very much opposed in the literature and in the versions that we hear from key figures within the organisation. And this is not just about the founding moment, but about the principle and the ideology of témoignage. So the dividing line here is essentially between the early founding doctors grouped around Bernard Kouchner and the later generation grouped around Ronnie Brauman. And each man kind of incarnates and advocates a particular vision of what happened. So in the Kouchner line, you have an emphasis on this idea of rupture with the Red Cross. He wrote an article, or co-wrote an article published in 1968 that described the conditions of working in Biafra and called for international intervention. He ties this specifically to the threat of genocide and in the larger critique to the notion that the International Committee of the Red Cross failed to speak out against the Holocaust during the Second World War. So Holocaust and genocide and the need to speak out become tied together in this view of what happened. The reason this is one of the reasons that this is problematic is partly that the ICRC, in fact, were quite pleased with what the French doctors were saying at the time. They reproduced the article that they published in the ICRC journal. So they were certainly not trying to silence what Kouchner and Recamier were saying. And another historian who's worked a lot on this period, Marie-Luce Desgrands-Champs, her work really underlines that the ICRC in this period actually did not have a very stable and rigid way of doing things. Its operational capacity was quite limited. It was very poorly established in sub-Saharan Africa. And it in fact, during the Nigerian Civil War, oscillated between speaking out, not speaking out, trying to influence, being part of the relief effort within Biafra, stepping away. So the notion that there was a lot of crackdown on speaking doesn't really fit with the image that we have of the ICRC. So that's the Kouchner side. On Ronnie's side, he emphasizes that the notion, the idea about genocide was manipulated, was exaggerated, and sees people who took this view as being manipulated by the Biafran leadership. I should say as well, if you go outside of humanitarian circles, you know, there are many other things to say about this period and the question of whether this was a genocidal war or a genocide, you know, has much broader implications in Nigerian history. But in relation to this case, there's an idea of manipulation of an attempt to speak out. He emphasizes that the first MSF charter came slightly later, but the first MSF charter did not actually have a clause about speaking out. And then he places this practice much more in the period where he was leading the organization. So the notion of témoignage is something that followed with later generations of MSF staff and leadership, rather than something that derived from this moment that was supposed to have happened in 1968. So I thought whether this matters is something that we might return to in the discussion after, because I think that would be an interesting thing to hear from current staff at MSF, whether you need a moment, a date on the calendar in order for that to be significant. Personally, I think if we look in that longer trajectory, there are also important influences. The East Pakistan crisis, which comes a year or two later, again, that's sort of an enriching part of the story. But for me, I think the importance of recognizing this longer history is to say institutional cultures, organizational cultures aren't sort of created in one drop and then innate. They're built over time, and that gives a different sort of avenue for discussing how we might think about those cultures, change them, be part of them in later periods. So I think it matters, but not for the sake of accuracy, per se. So my third section of the talk takes, as I said, this moment of Munich, 1972. And it's a very particular moment when views about revolutionary violence are shifting. And I chose it as an interesting counterpoint to Biafra because it is very close in time. You know, we're really in the same period as this early thinking about the origins of a Sans-Frontiérisme movement is happening. But it's a really different group of people. Then what we see as the decade continues is that some of these people come together and are actually in these joint conversations later in the 1970s about what kinds of responsibilities they bore for suffering and injustice, both at home and abroad. So I'm hoping that we can have some useful interaction between the two, even though in some levels they're a little far apart. So early in the morning of the 5th of September, 1972, so keep in mind MSF's founded December 1971, we're only a few months later. In that morning, 2 Israeli athletes from the Olympic team had been killed and 9 more were taken hostage by a team of Palestinian commandos at the Olympic Village in Munich. There were several hours of negotiations, a really disastrous rescue attempt, and it ended with the death of all 11 of the hostages, plus 5 of the Palestinians there, and a policeman as well. The Palestinian commandos belonged to an organization called Black September, which is a reference to the attacks on Palestinian camps in Jordan in September 1970, and it's almost sort of by the by, but there were some members of these early French doctors groups that were at the origins of MSF who went to Jordan in that time, were involved in sort of military medical efforts there. So there were thousands of media representatives in Munich in this moment, there to cover the Olympic Games, but of course all eyes turned to that hostage crisis. And you might have seen there's a very haunting image of one of the commandos sort of on the balcony with his face covered that comes from this period. So for certain of the tiers-mondiste groups in France, this particular event had a really important significance for their thinking about their own activism. Amongst these movements, support for the Palestinian cause was very important, but it contrasted at the time with an image of Palestinians as in need of refugee aid rather than political backing. So not a nationalist cause, but a cause that needed assistance. And this image was part of why there were groups amongst those, amongst the Palestinian sort of network of groups that turned towards terrorist acts in this time, such as Black September and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. So the Gauche Prolétarienne, one of the Maoist groups that had emerged in France after May 68, had several points of contact, if you like, with this Palestinian cause. So firstly, activism and engagement in a more general sense. They also had personal contacts with representatives of the Palestinian Liberation Organization particularly, and they were invited to participate in training camps by the PFLP, so by one of these sort of more extreme groups around this time. So while they declined that invitation, the GP, the Gauche Prolétarienne, it remained the group that in France at this time came closest to the kinds of violence that we saw in Europe in this period, so terrorist violence. We might associate more with the Red Army faction, for instance, or in Italy there are a lot of this sort of left-wing violence campaigns as well. And things like sabotage, reprisal attacks, they kidnapped some factory bosses. They also did some more kind of absurdist, sort of theatrical kind of things as well, but on this fringe. And one of the reasons there was quite a strong perception of their potential for violence was because they used a lot of very violent rhetoric in their own newspaper. So there was a lot of sort of performative emphasis on the importance of this. So the GP had links with and a kind of commitment to the Palestinian cause, as well as this wider notion of the importance of revolutionary change in French society and globally. And Munich became a moment where its commitment to those things was questioned. But before I come to that, I just want to talk to you briefly about how I got there. I'm not sure how much the methodologies of historians are of interest to you, but in this case it's quite important because really working with two different sets of sources. So on the one hand, memoirs that were published by these activists, the leading members in particular, some quite close to the time, some sort of in the years following. And in this case, we see a lot of consensus in their writing about how significant this moment was in changes in their thinking. So it's very, very clear in the retrospective accounts that this was a crucial moment. I also looked at sources that come from the time itself. So this is principally, in this case, the publications, the articles in their own newspaper, in La Cause du Peuple, and a few other documents. And what we see in those sources is a lot more ambivalent. It's a lot less clear that there's repudiation, although there's enough convergence that the memoirs aren't completely falsifying the record. But there's a bit of a mismatch there because of other pressures at the time. So there's a contrast between these two kind of sets of sources. So we need to use both of them with quite a lot of caution. So coming back to this question about why it was an important moment. So I've mentioned enough, I'm sure, that idea of the embrace of violence. But it's important to understand as well the wider mindset that informed that, and particularly the role of memories of the Second World War period in the way that engagement was understood. So the GP had what has been recognized as a kind of a vision of the world that came through the lens of anti-fascism. And to the extent that it saw itself as continuing that anti-fascist struggle, it also identified continuations of Vichy-era politics in France in the 60s and 70s. So the notion that when they had clashes with far-right groups, this was an encounter with neo-Nazism, for example. Their armed section, which was established in early 1970, was called Nouvelle Résistance Populaire, and there was a lot of emphasis on the importance of the resistance during the Second World War, the kind of continuation of the resistance through anti-fascism in the post-colonial period. And they paid a lot of attention to the trials or pardons of collaborators and war criminals from this period. And this is part of a wider story about how memories of this period, memories of the Holocaust or Shoah, of occupation, in the French case, memories of anti-fascism, played a kind of an important role in the imaginary of anti-colonialism in this period. Criticism of colonial violence during the Indochina Wars, during the Algerian War, really drew very heavily on these kind of tropes as well. And infamously, in May '68, we had these slogans like CRS equals SS, we are all German Jews, and so on. So while we see later on the use of Holocaust memories within humanitarian campaigning, actually this is building on a pre-existing use of those memories within anti-colonial and revolutionary campaigns. So this combination of revolutionary violence and Holocaust memories attention to the Second World War comes to a head with the Munich attack. And it was unavoidable for observers of this attack, to make that connection with the Holocaust, with the assault on Jewish civilians on German soil, and the notion of collective responsibility that attack represented. And this is what comes through when the Gauche Proletarian leaders write about why this turned them, or sort of accelerated their turn away from revolutionary violence. So the form of solidarity that they were being asked to show with the Palestinian cause, they say then, became too much to ask of them given their sort of worldview. And it feeds into kind of wider discussions. It's not the only influence, but it feeds into wider discussions about the role of terrorism, the conduct of guerrilla warfare, challenges to other kinds of images of third worldism, such as the destruction that was seen during the Cultural Revolution in China and so on, political prisoners in post-colonial regimes. So there are a number of different things going on, but it really crystallizes the various sort of influences upon revolutionary thinking at this time. In the book, I focus on ideas. I write about how people articulate their thinking, and I haven't really focused on the personal stories, but I think it's worth underlining that this period where there's an undoing of these engagements is a very turbulent, very difficult time for a lot of the people who are most strongly involved. So there's a personal impact to all of these stories that's quite significant. And again, in the memoirs, people write about moments of alienation, the social disruption, turn to alcoholism, and so on. There's a lot of private turmoil in this time, although it's not really what I focus on in the book. So as this period sort of continues on, the individuals associated with the GP, with the Maoist movement, are a sort of cohort amongst a wider set of discussions, books and memoirs that are rethinking left-wing activism and international politics in the 1970s. So there are sort of accounts of militancy that people publish. There's the work of the Nouveau Philosophe in a very different vein, but associated with anti-totalitarian criticisms that come up, and a sort of genre of prison literature that we see at this time. Reactions to news of the Khmer Rouge genocide is another important part of this. And also the work of journalists and foreign correspondents. So again, other kinds of people who are engaging with these events, and in some cases part of them or visiting these countries, who are writing about how do European or Western citizens and states sort of deal with third world countries with this shifting view of politics in this time of the paradigm shift. So there's a whole set of discussions that are starting in the 1970s. By the 1980s, they're a very self-referential conversation. Then these books and these articles are directly interacting with each other. And in this sense, the discussion about the decline of revolutionary dreams is really the intellectual terrain where humanitarian ideas are able to be debated, and where key sort of figures associated with Sans-Frontiérisme are articulating what humanitarian means coming into that space. So it's an important platform for the emergence of ideas about aid, about human rights, and about that notion of ethics, as I said. So I won't go into detail on those. We could perhaps come back, Michaël, if you'd like to, but one of these moments is the boat for Vietnam. episode, which in the case of MSF is associated with a schism where Kouchner and his sort of allies leave the organization, but in a wider intellectual history is a moment where we have an idea of consensus between Jean-Paul Sartre and Raymond Aron, these sort of great left and right counterparts who come together in the name of Vietnamese refugees. So there's an idea of the abandonment of ideological confrontation and an agreement on rights in this period. Another area of debate is the March for the Survival of Cambodia, which is 1980. Which is a protest march and more in the vein of the anti-communist campaign of certain of the MSF leaders at that time. But again, where we're seeing this sort of use of these wider discussions about third world politics within the humanitarian frame. And of course, Ethiopia and Libertés Sans Frontières, which is where I was starting off really in this discussion on the way in which ideas about Third-Worldism and Sans-Frontiérisme have interacted. So I think I might leave it there for now. We can come back to maybe some wider kind of reflections about the significance of the book. But thank you very much for listening, and I'll look forward to your questions and reactions.
Does it work this way? Yes. Okay. So I can pass the mic around. If there is any... Yes? Please introduce yourself.
Do you want this?
Hello, I'm Fabrice. I'm working for The Crash. I wanted to make a comment on what you said. Was a témoignage invented by Bernard Kouchner in Biafra in 1968 or by Ronnie Broman in Ethiopia in 1985? When I went through the archive, what I found is that, as you said, that the first MSF charter was pretty much straightforward with regards to silence. The first charter explicitly said that MSF would prevent itself from making any judgment on the events of what was happening in the country, about the authority who were hosting its activities. So it was the first charter is explicitly against the notion of témoignage. And the first speaking out was done in 1977 by Claude Maluret, coming back from the Cambodian border in Thailand, where he denounced the crimes of the Khmer Rouge. And it was so it's maybe Claude Maluret who invented témoignage, and using the same justification as the Bernard Kouchner, basically saying that in the face of genocide and totalitarianism, the humanitarian actors could not remain neutral. And this brand of témoignage greatly played into the Cold War, because it was clearly supportive of the neo-conservative movement. At that time, MSF received some funding from the National Endowment for Democracy, which was a foundation, American foundation, whose main purpose was to support the American soft power. So, just for the origin of témoignage in MSF.
But perhaps a comment, and then you can continue or see comment Fabrice's remark. But I mean, you were saying that you didn't spend much time on individual trajectories. At the same time, there are, few figures that are well known, or amongst the founders or the developers of MSF that are well situated in the book for their personal political history and profile. So we know that Ronnie Broman was a member of the GP, for instance. We know that Kouchner had a Cuban phase. He went there and met with Fidel Castro. We know that Claude Maluret was a member of the Partie socialist unifié, and that a few others had their Algerian war moment as well. Mm-hmm. So there were most of those figures that we meet at times in the organization very much existed in this 1960s and 1970s political life and debates that you've described. And the question I have is how much they're joining this Sans-Frontiérisme movement, or not only they joined it, but they sort of like shaped it, was an abandonment of politics, or rather a shift to a different way of seeing the world in politics, which is perhaps, what part of the book is about, whether there is a transition, an opting out, or just a way of seeing things differently.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll start, Fabrice. I think you're quite right to emphasize that Cambodia moment, not just because of its importance in that sort of active speaking out and the new leadership sort of already coming to the fore. And I wouldn't say that Honi claims that speaking out was invented in Ethiopia, but that it wasn't invented in Biafra, so somewhere in between, right? But Cambodia is particularly important also for the memory discussion, because it's actually at that time where the argument about the failure of the ICRC in the Second World War becomes part of the argument made. I couldn't find really references to that concept of the failure to speak out. So for those who are not familiar with this story, the committee of the International Committee of the Red Cross in 1942, they debated whether they would take a public stand about Nazi persecution of the Jews, and they decided not to. And this, in later Kushner kind of lyricism, is really pinpointed as the kind of ultimate moral failure of humanitarianism. But he doesn't really link this to Biafra until the moment of Cambodia, which is a time where there is a lot of emphasis on the notion of a new Holocaust, a kind of return of Holocaust imagery and so on. So it's really important in that story as well as the, if you like, the institutional témoignage story. Michaël, for the individuals, I didn't mean to suggest that there weren't people's trajectories, but I don't think that I really can speak to the individual's internal experience. I'm not claiming that I could say what all of these engagements meant for individuals, but I try to show how they presented it on a public level, and really that's a lot of how they, how a sort of public story about these engagements was built. So it's the fact that it's not internal, I think, that is important. But you're right, there are a number of individuals who span kind of the different types of engagement that I write about, either across really quite a long period or kind of focused on some particular moments and then kind of stepping away. So one of the phenomena of this that I find very interesting is actually if we go a little bit lower than the most famous people, those names that are more familiar, there are people who for decades are really essential to these discussions. So Gérard Chalion is one of them, who is really an expert in this discussion, a very thoughtful writer. Jean-Pierre Le Dantec is one of the other Maoists who goes sort of through this moment of the GP, of rethinking, writes very eloquently, I find, about that. So it's really important that personal trajectory. But again, I just try to be cautious about how much I could attribute motivations to people. Having said that, trying not to avoid your question entirely, I think a lot of these engagements are either continuation or not separate in the beginning. It's easy in hindsight to want to sort of say, well, is it in the revolutionary left box, or is it in the humanitarian box? And for some of these, for these people, it's an interest in the world, you know, and it's a desire to shoulder, you know, a desire to be part of change, I think, that underpins some of these engagements, and that's why you get a kind of overlap, if you like, and an opportunism almost on the part of some of these engagements. I think, I mean, it would depend again on the individual cases. I think another thing to consider is that when you do have people like Claude Malhuret working with Rony, others, then the techniques of leftist politics become quite useful in an organizational setting. So you have an understanding of factionalism, of you know, how to operate, that has been linked to that kind of the kind of pointy shoulders of those leftist engagements as well. So it's a different kind of continuation, I suppose.
Questions? All right, I have another one then. Oops, Nathalie.
Hi, I'm Nathalie. I'm the emergency desk manager for MSF in France. I thought it was interesting that you mentioned the invention and témoignage, and how it, you know, the discourse behind that has sort of shapes today's MSF stuff. I wonder if you could develop a bit more on that, and maybe the link with, like you're saying, individuals have shaped what we consider to be MSF, and groups of individuals at different times. I wonder if you have any thoughts on whether that's still possible today within an organization that's now as big as MSF and as international as MSF, or whether that's something that's just, it's part of our history and now we just say, well, that's part of our history, we move on.
Okay, so I am definitely going to ask you to answer that question once I've stopped talking. Prepare yourself. Maybe something to add to the picture of the 1980s that I gave you is the way that that Ethiopia and Libertés Sans Frontières were part of also the internationalization of MSF. So you might have noticed that in that part of the talk, I was sort of emphasizing MSF France, because by this time, you know, the other sections have started to emerge. And are people familiar with the argument that happened between the MSF sections in relation to this political campaigning? Can you just wiggle your head? No?
Probably develop a bit.
Okay.
Feel free.
Okay. Okay. So what you see in this time is a clash between a more politically active French section and a Belgian section, which isn't entirely separate. There are individuals within that, and there's obviously a kind of an uptake of some of the identity of the French section, but likewise much more oriented towards development working, different kinds of public health interventions, more cooperative with government and so on, and much less comfortable with public positions. And so what happens is there's a move to censure the French section on the basis of the Charter by saying the Charter prevents this kind of political activism, and in fact a legal dispute that takes place in this period. So even though it's quite early in the internationalization, to come back to your point about the size, it's quite early in that story, we're still already seeing the pulling apart of these different cultures in different sections, despite their novelty. In terms of what I meant by that reference, I think one of the benefits of looking at the history of humanitarianism, or of anything, is it reminds us that things have been different, right? That things are not inherently the way they are and unchangeable. They come about for specific reasons in particular contexts. They're influenced by external, internal forces, personalities. chance. And when we recognize that, it allows us to challenge the notion that there's no alternative to what we have today. So I think returning to the idea that the concept of témoignage had to be built. And it wasn't only MSF that built it. You look at the Quaker movement, for instance, there are traditions there. It's not a monopoly. But that as an idea, as a set of practices, it had to be developed. It didn't come fully formed in the way that, you know, the Kushner version likes to tell it a bit. And for me, you know, as an outsider, that looks like an opportunity to participate in the continuation of building that culture rather than to just receive it. So that's what I meant. I hope that makes sense. So how does that sound to you?
Yeah, no, it sounds good. I just thought it was interesting because I've been participating often in sessions for new joiners to MSF, people who join MSF. And it's interesting to ask them when their first day is, well, what do you think MSF is? And they come out with almost a sort of institutional kind of vision of MSF, Biafra, you know, témoignage, things like that. And it's interesting that somehow in society or in culture, this is how we're perceived, I guess. And then when their first weeks of working in the field, they realize that maybe it's not quite so simple. But it's just, I think, interesting for us to understand how can we translate our history in a sort of package for new joiners to MSF. It's not very easy.
Yeah, and everyone does that. I mean, it's not, you know, all organizations do that. And I, Monday and Tuesday this week, I was attending the Save the Children Centenary Conference. So they're celebrating their 100th birthday. And one of the discussions that they are having about their history is that the sort of short myth, if you like, of Save the Children is that it was founded by Eglantine Jebb, who was a saintly, selfless, sickly woman who kind of had these visions and devoted her life to saving children. Short version. And actually, the very early days of Save the Children were, again, much more politically activist. The choice to focus on children in that very first moment was a tactic that was explicitly designed to get around some of the sensitive politics, but these were very well-connected figures in the British sort of political left, and they were very knowing. And much more radical than the image of Jebb. And so that reminding kind of current staff about that story is not in order to correct them, but just to say we don't always have to be kind of hiding away from politics, because that's not really who we are. It's a more complicated picture. Yeah.
Other questions? I still do have one. All right. Well, perhaps in pursuing that line of questions, there's a historian who wrote a book about human rights, Samuel Moyne, who called human rights the last utopia. And in a way, it seems that for a period of time, the humanitarianism you describe, or the Sans-Frontiérisme in particular, that particular type, and human rights, totally converge. And I wanted to also they converge in, you know, because activists are quite the same, but also because it seems that in a way humanitarianism also becomes a last utopia for people who had many others, but whose utopia failed. And I was wondering if that convergence was as total as it seems it was. And also, when do you think came the moment where those two quite distinct ideologies, if you look at them today, came to separate from one another?
Okay. Your questions are not the easiest ones, though, I have to say. Right. I think, so if you take a very long view, then you would see something like this, like different ideas about what humanitarianism is, and different languages and ideas related to rights. and they would fluctuate in how close or far apart they were at different times. I think in the period that I look at and the people that I looked at, I think they're very close together, particularly in that moment in around sort of the late 1970s, where there's an effort to describe the fact that that we shouldn't be thinking in terms of left and right anymore, and that's what comes with the vote for Vietnam, and that image of consensus is that what matters is not what left wing, right wing, but this notion of ethics, notion of democratic engagement, kinds of activism that that maybe don't always explicitly use the language of rights, but where I think you see a blurring of those kind of ideas around, sort of civil society, we might say now, and forms of engagement, whether local or more international, that are using kind of rights frameworks. So I think it's very pronounced. There is a period, again, Marie, there is a period where there are people at the top of MSF who talk about MSF's work as being rights-based, as being a form of human rights, like direct action human rights, if you like, sort of working to protect people's rights, not through political or legal forums, but through their own kind of direct interventions. And then that language seems to just to drop away. And it would be hard for me to put a particular date on it, but I think what we're seeing is the way that professionalization of these kinds of careers has led to a sort of hardening of differences that pre-existed or predated those careers. So while, for instance, you would always have found a lot of lawyers in discussions about human rights, by the time you get to very professionalized NGO world, then you have human rights organizations and humanitarian organizations and development organizations. And again, there's overlap between them, or sometimes, they're multi-mandate, but there's a way in which organizations and individuals within them start to identify with particular professional practices that I think pulls them further apart, which is much more recent, I would say, and not particularly French or French only, as the book is covering. Does that match your experience, your sense? Yeah.
Yes. Micro.
Actually, just on the last one, I'm Emmanuel, and I was an MSF advocacy manager in South Sudan for MSF Spain. On the last thing, what I have seen, because I have the double career, I was working in human rights for 18 years. And then I freak out because of the politics, and then I moved to the humanitarian because I want something more practical. And actually, I'm quite new in MSF. That was my first mission. I have done only 2 humanitarians, WAHA International and MSF. What I saw in my personal experience, also as part of many human rights NGOs, UN, etc., was that the key word which splits up the two movements, let's say, is actually impunity. And on that particular case, we had already this agreement with Ronnie Broman after my return from Congo as a UN human rights officer in Sciences Po, where he was talking about peace, and the role of MSF and other organizations in humanitarian situation, blah, blah, blah. And I said, fine, but you cannot have peace with impunity. Mm-hmm. And then we entered in the whole argument of human rights or humanitarians, NGOs, and this is where the témoignage comes in also. Because when you are seeing, witnessing, and speaking out, you are provoking at the international level exactly the sense of responsibility. Mm. What I have never understood, and maybe you help me on that or help us, was exactly why there was this split up that I have seen so many times between humanitarians and human rights NGOs regarding the rights approach. Because at the end of the day, MSF is about human dignity, which is strictly connected to respect of human rights, or to the right of health, which again is an international human rights. Mm. So it's still not clear, but I have the impression from what I saw from inside MSF and the way that heads of mission or desks or higher level, people not in the field, are approaching the whole issue, is that we are in some kind of reservation or new conservatism, because exactly there are all these political games, analysis, international relations, Darfur, and every single NGO has a nightmare of being manipulated by media, diplomats, or foreign governments. And I have the impression that especially the humanitarian movement right now is exactly in this kind of phase. Mm-hmm. We shall not get manipulated, thus we talk less. Mm. And that's the phase of the witnessing mandate that I have felt the last years, actually.
Mm. Yeah, and I guess I sort of wouldn't want to speculate on the now too much, obviously, but it just underlines the fact that, again, these are ideas, ideologies that react to other things, so that it's not about a sort of a static one vision that just can kind of plow forward in time. Is what people are doing around you, the sort of changes in the international architecture, other pressures, are going to then shape what that looks like in any given moment, and depending on the wider politics as well. So that was very helpful for me in understanding that too. I think Laurence, I might have, I hope I'm associating your name correctly, with some work that I've done around discussions at the time of the genocide in Rwanda. There was a kind of effort to capture in time, I think, gathered together some of the testimonies and the reports that were coming back with a view to, we're going to need this. Like, we need a sort of active documentary record of what we're seeing, while also, again, it's well known, MSF took a very strong stance then, but that notion of the data and the responsibility to capture that information was quite coming through to me quite clearly. And I think you were very important in that work at that time. Yeah.
Just to confirm what you said, it's true. And if I remember well, because as I told you a few minutes ago, I wrote this case study 15 years ago, so it's a long time. These accounts of victims, of witnesses, and were collected and were given, were transmitted to the tribunal in Arusha for Rwanda, and were used as a sort of not during the trials, of course, but before the trials to establish the fact that there had been a genocide. Among other documents, of course, it was not MSF who was the key witness in that, but yeah, that happened. And then just since I have the mic, and I'm not very comfortable to do that. It's not up to me to do that, but I'm going to do it still. If you want to within MSF, there are some tools to learn more about MSF history. We have the series of the case studies on speaking out, and so 12 so far. And recently we produced this huge study about the history of the international associative movement, where you can find maybe some answers to some questions that were asked today.
Yeah, tiens, Fabrice, derrière.
You said that the word I introduced myself. I'm Elba. You said that the word tiers-mondisme isn't well chosen. Could you explain why? And would you say the same for Sans-Frontiérisme?
So the tiers-mondisme in the singular, you mean that? Is that what you... Tiers-mondisme, you said, right? Yeah. Yeah, I guess the sort of maybe the short way to explain that a little more is to say if you tried to use that word in the, I guess, the 50s or the early 1960s, it probably wouldn't mean anything at all. You would have Maoists, Castroists, you would have specific organizations, tiny groups, kind of groupuscule. There's a flourishing of different things, but it's a term that comes later and that comes out of the criticism, really, of those groups, or the sort of attempt to make them into historical objects themselves. There were, the term gauchiste was used. It would capture a kind of wider range than I really study in detail in the books, or kind of Trotskyists and so on, that were interested in the third world, perhaps less kind of oriented around it. But this notion of tiers-mondisme, we see it more in the 1980s than in the time where those ideas were influential. So it's useful because it captures a phenomenon in a way, but it's limited in that it lumps them all together and tries to kind of make them a bit the same thing, which they weren't. Sans-Frontiérisme, I think it's an important term in that it helps to get past the fact that, again, humanitarianism is very big, means a lot of different things. It's a term that has been applied since sort of 18th, 19th century to many different sets of ideas, sets of practices, objectives. And I think Sans-Frontiérisme just helps us narrow down a little bit to this period and, again, a kind of varied movement, but a smaller group. So both, I suppose, imperfect in some ways. I'm not sure whether Sans-Frontiérisme is something that you feel that you're part of, but it allows, I think, a bit more precision than the notion of humanitarianism, which is a bit, everything for everyone in some ways.
The comment I would follow up with then is, it's more a comment, not a question, because that would be complicated for you to answer. It's not so much whether Sans-Frontiérisme meant something in the late 70s or early 1980s, if it means anything today. And to that, I'm perplexed, but happy to welcome your comments. Fabrice?
It's just a comment like this, because I like, following the question of Michaël, was humanitarianism the continuation of politics by other means? When you're talking about the founders of MSF and how their past militant activities help them as well to navigate MSF. Bon, what I see today, maybe I'm wrong, but it's among our new colleagues coming from Congo, Sudan, Kenya. This is where I see new MSFer with a past militant activities. I mean, who a continuation of politics by other means, less from expatriate from Europe. And I don't want to culturalize the debate, but I see that if you look at the personal trajectory of our colleagues, the most where you find people who reinvest their militancy in humanitarian work is mostly people who come from the country where we used to intervene.
Yeah. So I have a historical thought and a current day thought. One is part of the reason why it makes sense to talk about that continuation of politics idea is because I've been focusing on more the people who published, the people who sometimes spoke for organizations or who were in a position to be on page 2 of Le Monde. Always, if you look at other levels, there are other profiles. So, in the early 1970s, where MSF was, it was sort of a group. It wasn't an organization. It was in some ways a kind of recruitment sort of function it was playing. And there were networks there of doctors who weren't coming out of these radical circles that didn't have student kind of political background. The kind of, in some periods, the types of supporters that MSF might have been attracting perhaps were more inclined to kind of keep their leftist views and not agree with the anti-communism because there was a sort of, again, an interest in the wider world and a chance to do something good. So I think you also got to keep that sense of you can't take the experience of those most prominent people to be the experience of everyone. In relation to today, as I said, I'm teaching humanitarianism, and as you mentioned, in an institute where one of our goals is to train people to go into fields or careers like this. And it really strikes me that a lot of our students talk about wanting to make a difference. They don't necessarily do that in very political terms. Like they talk about helping, they don't talk about changing, obstructing, protesting. And those that do often struggle in our degrees, that they find them to be a bit anemic because we talk about ethical dilemmas, we don't talk about how do you resolve injustice, right? So I think that, again, maybe this is more about professionalization and the notion of aid as a career path, but I would see quite a difference in the profiles of students that we are getting that are interested in this field, and committed people. It's not a question of a lack of commitment, but I think the attitude to what constitutes politics and what is your end goal is very different. Yeah.
Monsieur Guillaume.
I hope none of them are watching.
Hello, I'm Guillaume, I'm a historian. We've talked about témoignage, and I was thinking about evidence, the idea of doing politics by producing evidence, whether judiciary or epidemiological. So I'm wondering if you can locate moments where the idea that MSF could be also providers and makers of evidence emerge. Can you locate this on the long history of MSF?
Yeah, probably not. I don't know, maybe Fabrice, you have something to say on that. But there was, I'm trying to think, I can't even remember which context of that, but I did get told there was a report that had confidential stamped on it that was intentionally stamped with that in order to make sure that it sounded very desirable to read and would circulate, far and wide. So a very knowing use of that, the sort of access to the field and the opportunity to bring in evidence that others don't have. I don't think that I have looked enough internally at the dynamics to give a real answer to your question. I don't, Michaël.
Okay. For me, the notion of evidence is recent. What was at stake in the early 70s, 80s was the notion of witness. And evidence is a new concept which has more to do with a forensic approach to establishing truth and using our expertise in public health. Now we use a lot more epidemiological data than personal witnessing to produce facts that could interfere. But
just to complete, because I agree with Fabrice, it's also I don't know which kind. If you're talking of legal evidence, for instance, I think it appeared with the tribunal, the international tribunals. Then we realized that maybe our reports and our accounts, witness accounts, can be used, and we set up a policy regarding that. And voila. So I would say that the Rwanda thing, the accounts we were talking, maybe they were the first. No, before.
Well, Epicent was created in 1987. with a view of doing training, but also providing figures to back up MSF experiences. And I think we've done that throughout the 1980s in the context of Somalia, in the context of Bangladesh, before Rwanda.
No, but I'm talking about legal evidence that could be used legally. I'm not talking about...
because the evidence in the field of public sphere, like figures used in the media to back up personal experiences of people
in Somalia and so on.
is not as recent as that. It's probably almost like 30 years that epidemiological expertise has been mobilized to back up what was essentially a witnessing experience.
Yeah, but I was not talking about epidemiological data.
It's a switch from the moral witness to the judiciary witness, which has to do with the development of the international criminal justice.
So in what I've looked at, again, it's more the public facing, and it's sometimes it's the sort of first person witnessing. It's a particular person that's speaking, and there's also the phenomenon of kind of spectacular protest style, like creating something for someone else to witness, and that is the evidence that aid isn't working. It's a very different kind of idea from the notion of evidence being brought forward. Yeah.
But if I may, I think it's a good illustration of your point about how the notion of témoignage has been fabricated and has evolved from the position of the moral witness, the personal account during the Cold War, with a background which was the support to the liberal camp against communist ideologies. And this changed over time. It changed with the end of the Cold War. We had a stage in our history where we were somehow sharing a kind of liberal internationalist ideals, when we thought that with the end of the Cold War, the rebirth of the United Nations, there was a place for a new kind of international management of conflict, and where witnessing was seen as a way to provoke international reaction, but not in the fight against communism, in the idea that the international community, without specifically naming who it was, could intervene to stop massacres, to put an end to impunity. And when all these phenomena started to materialize, first with the US-led intervention in Somalia, and later on with Afghanistan, Iraq, and with the creation of the ICC, témoignage, speaking out, as you mentioned, had a different meaning, and would support war propaganda, would support judiciary process, and therefore the meaning of speaking out, we are a bit afraid of our shade, and a bit afraid of how our words now could be used in war propaganda or judiciary processes.
The interpretation is different.
Yeah. So it's right.
Yeah, and a lot of the way that témoignage is articulated in the period I look at is focused on the righteousness of the act often, the need to do it in order to sort of be in keeping with your own ethics. And that's, that Ethiopian case, you see that sort of notion that because the understanding is one in which aid is part of the problem, then silence is itself part of the problem, and that the clashes between MSF and other aid organizations there is very pronounced on that issue of, is silence the same as complicity, is sort of acceptance, or is it the price you pay in order to do the work that you need to do, and that they're fundamentally different moral standpoints. That they're not. It's not a debate about the same thing, really. What you see in that period, but yeah, very strong emphasis on the ethics, sort of in a way for its own sake.
Okay, we're coming to a close, unless there are some last-minute questions. And if not, then the conversation can actually continue around the apéro, just behind that closed doors over there that are going to get open very soon. I'm not wrapping that up. I do advise you very, very strongly, actually, to read the book. This is a wonderful account of French politics in the 60s and 70s. But before that, I do have a last word from Juliette, so please, the mic is yours. Tiens, Fabrice.
As a witness of MSF in Afghanistan, I was just in the middle of watching MSF in Paris develop Sans-Frontiérisme with heads who were had given up the utopia of communism. And in Afghanistan, I was working with leaders who had grabbed Islamism as their own Sans-Frontiérisme, who also came from, who were Maoist, Leninist. You had all of the array. And so I find it fascinating to see that at the same time, in the same period of time, there was this same questioning, the same realization of the collapse of the utopia, but it was it ended up in different directions. The grammar was different, but the origin was kind of the same, and seeking rules, human rights in Europe, in those other countries where they didn't have that history of human rights in their culture. They went back to Quran or more rigid rules as well. So it was quite interesting, and this is coming together. Islamist, is that another form of Sans-Frontiérisme?
Am I allowed to pass that one for now? I'm not.
It's a perfect time.
Sure. Allow me to answer, but thank you so much for that reflection. I hope we can talk in a moment.
Thank you very much.